Now I think we're going to transition more into audience questions for our panelists too, and then we'll turn to our colleagues at ODEI for a wrap up. So we do have one question I see in the chat from Georgiana for Shelley. So it's asking about the advice for participants related to the recommendation you made to ask students about their identity and their tribal affiliation. And she's just noting that this was different than some advice they had received previously. So many feel like asking the question might be an act of othering or telling someone they don't belong. So just curious if you could provide a little more insight into asking Native students about their identity and their tribe.
Right. So I think one of the really important things to understand is that Native identity is not a racial identity. And we get lumped in with racial identities on every kind of admissions paperwork or student identification paperwork that comes through our institutions. But Native identity is really a political, a sovereign, a tribal identity. And when we lump Native students all together as one population, we really do miss the important nuances between and among and that different tribal groups bring and different tribal understandings bring for our students. So we always try to encourage you to not talk, if you're talking about individual students, talk about what their tribal affiliation is and identify them by tribe, and not as a Native American student, right? Not as an Indigenous student. Because it really is important to understand that tribal identity is something that students come with based on their communities of understanding of tribal identity, and not based on understandings outside of that community, right? And you want to value what the student has come to the institution with and the understandings of their identity that the student has come to the institution with. But I do understand this idea of othering, because we often have students who don't want to say that they're Native, even if they are Native, even if they're tribal members, don't identify themselves as Native when they come into the institutions. And when we've had conversations with students who have done this, they have made it clear every single time, I don't want to be seen as Native because I don't want people to assume that I'm going to fail, that I'm going to have a hard time, that I need tutoring, that I need extra help, right? I just want to be a student who has all the ability to succeed. And if I tell people I'm Native, they're automatically going to assume that I can't succeed, that I don't have the ability, right? And so that's on us. That's our fault. That if we're creating an institution or an atmosphere where we're just letting, we're assuming and we're putting it out there that Natives need so much help and so much support, that's wrong. We know that our students are able. We know that when they are really tied to their communities, tied to their culture, they do even better. So we really need to work hard to ensure that when we talk about Native students, when we talk about Indigenous students, we come from a strengths-based perspective and not the deficit view, right? So that's our challenge, and making sure that when our students come and they see us and their communities and their families come, that they can see that we're coming from a strength-based perspective and admiring and respecting tribal identities.
You. And are there any other questions coming from our group here? If not, I have additional questions that I could pose to the group.
I have one, if you'll indulge me. Shelley, having lived and worked both within the context of private and public higher educational institutions, what would you say is the one particular strength for Native students in the Metro Boston area, and the one particular challenge?
I think one of the strengths about coming into the Boston metropolitan area is, and I don't know how well we rely and kind of grab onto this strength, is the fact that there is such a large Native student population across multiple institutions in this metropolitan region. We, I think, don't do a good job connecting our students to each other and kind of really building a much larger support network than what they find within their individual institution. So, you know, that's not exactly how our institutions want us to work, right? They don't want us to be focused on other institution students. But I think that we could definitely find avenues and ways to host different events for local students, right? Get them connected to what are the local resources, because we've seen, especially throughout this past year, that there are local resources for our Native students that maybe they hadn't thought about taking advantage of before, and that our institutions hadn't thought about making them aware of or understanding that there are resources for them outside of our institutions that they can take advantage of. So NICOB being one, North American Indian Center of Boston, right? The Native American Lifelines. I mean, they really stepped up and offered lots of resources to local students over the past year. And even our Harvard students were taking advantage of some of the resources they were able to provide. So that's a positive, a real positive, I think, thing about being here in the more larger Boston metropolitan area. The other thing is, you know, I do feel like the resources between institutions are available to different students. So access to educational materials is amazing in this area because of all the institutions that are here. Access to different events that the different institutions are hosting. So if Brandeis is hosting some Native speakers, you know, now everything's online and we can all participate, we can all watch it. Even when they're not online, for the most part, when Natives programs and Native speakers are coming in, they're open to the public because we know that it's important to have this be available to students and faculty and staff in other institutions or just locally in general. But I think also it's been an interesting time to be in the Boston metro area. The conversations about Indigenous territory are real and they're complex, but they're important conversations that are really helping us to frame and think how, when we work with students, but how we situate students in this area, but how we think about our own work and how we're going to kind of move forward in this kind of very diverse area, very rich history, right? What's happening here in New England is very different of what's happening in the Southwest or in the Great Plains. And the history that we have out here is really important to understand. And I think it's starting to unfold as we confront some of the real challenges to the Native history in this area. And if students are here now, I think this is a really unique time to learn how do we address the historical issues that are going to be confronting other parts of the country as well.